Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's Moon Dialogs Research Salon, International Collaboration for Lunar Exploration, the Practitioner's View. I'm Mehak Sarang. I'm the Lunar Exploration Projects Lead with the MIT Space Exploration Initiative, one of the co-conveners of the Moon Dialogues, and co-lead of the Accessible Moon Theme and Action Team, along with Michelle Hanlon of For All Moonkind. Today marks our first research salon for the Accessible Moon theme. Accessible Moon focuses on international collaboration strategies, specifically to bring new voices across academic fields, industry, and governments into lunar activities. This action team has a goal of coordinating multi-stakeholder activity with a shared respect for the space commons while promoting the peaceful use of outer space. Today, we're very excited to be joined by three individuals with extensive experience working in international convening bodies, such as the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, the World Economic Forum, and others to not only discuss, but implement standards, regulations, protections, and guidelines for actors on Earth and in near space. Today, you'll see that we have Dr. Peter Martinez online. He's the Executive Director of the Secure World Foundation and has extensive experience in multilateral space diplomacy, space policy formulation, and space regulation. Prior to joining the Secure World Foundation, he chaired the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space working group on the long-term sustainability of outer space activities that negotiated a set of international consensus guidelines to promote the safety and sustainability of space operations. We also have Dr. Marlene Losier, and you can wave when I introduce you so people have a chance, there you go, is a legal expert in international law. She advises private and public clients regarding the international and national legal policy implications of transnational disputes over rare objects found on land, underwater, and beyond Earth, particularly as they involve the succession of states. She advises also on creating new domestic and international laws with respect to cultural properties, and is part of the team at For All Moonkind thinking about cultural heritage preservation on the lunar surface. Finally, we have Dr. Minoo Rathnasabathy, who can also raise your hand, thank you, is a research engineer with a space-enabled research group at the MIT Media Lab, so across the hall from us, which seeks to advance justice in Earth's complex systems using designs enabled by space. In this role, she helps coordinate projects in collaboration with international development organizations, national governments, and entrepreneurial companies to apply space technology in support of the Sustainable Development Goals. She also leads efforts in establishing the Space Sustainability Rating in collaboration with the World Economic Forum and the European Space Agency. We're very excited to welcome these three panelists and learn from their practical experiences as we look ahead to think about international collaboration for lunar exploration. In addition, our panelists and you all as our participants in the Moon Dialogues community will help frame our Accessible Moon theme today. We want to ask what it means practically to ensure that the moon remains the province of all humankind. What are the near-term challenges to accessibility? What protections do our panelists wish to see in place, especially with lessons learned from seeing events unfold both on Earth and in low Earth orbit? Do we need to establish new international fora with a broader set of actors to discuss such issues? We invite you to join our shared Miro board to please post any questions and comments that you have as this discussion progresses. I'll post a link in the chat, and we'll also do a quick screen share to show you how the platform works. We've used Miro a few times, so hopefully you're a bit more familiar with this round. As you can see, we have a main section where you can capture comments from the participants and from the panelists. Please use this color coding system so you can add your own comments in yellow. And then on the side, you'll see that there's an ability to ask some questions, and we'll be calling on questions at the end during the Q&A portion of this discussion. If you're more accustomed to and like to use traditional note-taking methods, you can click on this note tool at the top and have just regular notes taking here. All right, so if you have any questions about that, please PM me and I can help you navigate the Miro board. During the discussion, we please invite you to keep your videos on, but your microphones muted. We want to encourage the development of a community in this discussion. Furthermore, today's Moon Dialogues is part of our annual MIT Space Week and the Space Exploration Initiative's Beyond the Cradle event, which will be taking place for the rest of the afternoon. And we welcome you to join the live stream linked in the chat for further events this afternoon. All right, with that, I would like to warmly welcome and thank our panelists today for joining us and hand it off to Michelle Hanlon of For All Moonkind, who will be moderating the roundtable discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Mehak. First, let me just say we owe a huge round of gratitude for Mehak and her team for setting up this entire Moon Dialogue. She has undergone it, as far as I can tell, single-handedly, she and her team, because I certainly didn't do anything at all except show up. And hopefully my internet won't blink out, so I will actually really show up. So I also want to really thank our panelists. I know people have Zoom fatigue, but I think this is such an important discussion, and I'm really thrilled to be able to, sort of open it here in the Moon Dialogues. It's near and dear to my heart. I just want to say about Minoo, don't be fooled. She's not sitting in Boston. She's reaching us from Australia. So thank you. It's really early in the morning, and we were commenting on how, lovely and bright and chipper she looks. And, it looks like I'm the one who's up at 4 in the morning. But I just want to start by saying, for all Moonkind, we talk about the universality of space, and we talk about how important it is and how the only way we will succeed as humans in space is if we are able to explore space and use space collaboratively and all together as one. And so one of the things we are doing is sort of trying to break down this concept of sovereignty. And we always challenge about the paradigm of sovereignty and what does it mean, and do we really need it for space? And that's really a precursor. The precursor to that conceptualization is this concept of accessibility. And what does it mean to make sure that all of humanity is able to participate and able to embrace and able to harness these resources? But then let's boil that down even more, as a law professor, just like, let's go back. All my classes start in like 17th century England. So I want to start with, first of all, want to again welcome all the many familiar faces I see that I've missed during this school year, and I hope that you all will see a lot more of me now that we had my last class yesterday. Yay! But I want to start and think about what does accessibility actually mean in the context of the moon and lunar governance? Is it about democratization? And I'd like to have you start with that, Minoo.
Yeah, thank you so much. And let me start by first thanking the organizers of the Moon Dialogs Salon and also the Space Exploration Initiative. I've joined a few of your sessions, and so I'm really honored to be part of this important discussion. And I certainly would not wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning for any other discussion. So you can tell that this is important to me. I will say that my definition of accessibility is constantly evolving. The more I speak to countries that are being part of the space sector and their initiatives and priorities, as well as the rapid technological development with regards to exploration, my definition is constantly changing. But in my work, I deal with the term sustainability on a day-to-day basis. And I think accessibility, like the word sustainability, has been widely used in different contexts. So much so that we're really accustomed to these words. And while we might all agree on the general thread of accessibility, there are a number of nuances that really need deeper discussion to go from theoretic idealization to reality. So in response to this question, I almost want to pose a few challenges to yourselves and the audience as well. So the discussion of accessibility, at least in my view, starts with acknowledgement. It's the acknowledgement that we all have different starting positions, if I can use the track and field analogy. There are established spacefaring nations that have already been working on lunar explorations for decades, and also many commercial companies that are offering everything from launch services to transportation. But the reality is that there are also a number of, increasing number, I should say, of emerging space nations whose priority is not necessarily the moon or lunar exploration just now, but it is on the utilization of space and space technologies to find solutions to some of their pressing Earth-based challenges, and really to establish a long-term accessibility to the moon. And when we talk about it, I want to talk about sustainable access to the moon. It requires broad engagement and collaboration. I remember at MIT Space Week a couple of years ago, Charlie Bolden, who's the former administrator for NASA, he told a story about how when the ambitious Apollo program got underway in the 1960s, the US was in the thick of a civil rights movement. And one one can argue that the world currently faces similar challenges as it did even 50 years ago. And yet they could recognize that there were great things to be done, and so they pressed on. And so in this era of lunar exploration, we already have a number of examples of international collaboration. Our collaboration between government, academia, and the private sector, and also collaboration between the space sector and other industries. So I want to acknowledge in answering this question that not all priorities are the same. And with that comes that there's different interests, different expertise, capabilities, and importantly, budgets as well. And with regards to lunar governance, the question of accessibility is the question of how do we ensure that everybody feels welcome at the table? Now, with this in mind, it's also important that we acknowledge the fact that we're in work in progress mode towards lunar governance structures with a number of geopolitical implications. Steps are being taken to establish multilateral ground rules for all countries who have the intention to head to the moon. And there's several examples. I won't go through them all, but I'm sure the audience has heard of many, including the Artemis Accords, the Moon Village Principles, the Hague Building Blocks, and of course, the UN Corpus General Exchange of Views. And I'm sure that Peter will talk more about that. And finally, in my response, I also think that we need to acknowledge just the scarcity of resources on the moon and how the language we use when we talk about lunar exploration. The history of lunar exploration is seated in conquest and competitions. And even today, we hear people talk about the moon as the new Wild West or the gold rush. You know, these terms have deep-seated social, economic, cultural, and environmental history. And while it is the next frontier, and it's also important to acknowledge that there are lessons from the past that should help us design accessibility in a way that we ensure that there's a common experience and outcome for us all. And so to this effect, there's also important to acknowledge and educate the general public on the importance of not just going to the moon as a way to explore further, but also what are the downstream benefits to the everyday person. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to my other panelists to also hear what they have to say.
Thanks. I think what really stuck out with me was sort of talking about the scarcity of resources on the moon. And, you know, we've started really talking in my classes here, lunar resource utilization is very different from space resource utilization in general. There are a lot of very different concepts to think about. But it was also interesting that you talked about lessons from the past. And Marlene, who is a cultural heritage expert and law expert. I wonder what you can add to this concept of accessibility and maybe share your views and perhaps the implication, what is the implication of the moon and its resources not being accessible?
Well, thank you, Michelle. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all of the participants and everyone who's joined us. I'm very happy to be here on this panel. Because accessibility is, I think, a main issue that we are struggling with regards to the exploration of outer space, in particular the moon. However, it's a subject, in my view, that we have been discussing now for about 80 years or more. And so when the topic of accessibility is raised, in my view, I don't see it as a new topic, even though the manifestation of what we're speaking of may be new, and our technology, our science to be able to operate outside Earth. About 80 years ago, with the establishment of the UN system, this is a subject that was considerably discussed. It was considered in a multilateral forum. Implications of accessibility were also thought through, and in the result, we developed a system of international laws and principles. And those principles address not only accessibility by a broad multilateral sector of states, but it also looked at what went wrong when accessibility wasn't considered. So within those treaty systems, we addressed two things: how to make our operations amongst ourselves accessible, whether it's on Earth and even beyond Earth when we started looking at space law treaties, but also how to correct what happens when we don't. So I guess that's the first point I would make in the way I approach this idea of accessibility. Second, again, deriving from that concept is that within that system that we developed of international laws within the last 80 years, there are a few important principles that we have extracted and used in order to make accessibility something that is attainable for a broad group of states that may not be scientifically, technologically advanced, economically in a position to participate as would other states in those situations. But key factors have been the identification of science, education, and culture. And within the United Nations treaty system, we have focused on those aspects in the world. And what we've done is even created a branch of the United Nations, which is UNESCO. And of course, then there's the creation of COPWAS. But within that branch, the emphasis was really on trying to identify advancements in science, culture, and education in order to be able to share that with the population in the world. And the thought was that once we were able to share that information with the world, we would be able to develop a system of self-determination in which not only individuals, but states would be able to charter their futures, and in a way that they thought most appropriate for themselves. So focusing on culture, science, and education has been a significant tool for accessibility on Earth so far. So when we open the discussion about accessibility on the moon and beyond, I think we should consider those principles as well as the other ones that had been developed within the treaty systems. Although the rules may not necessarily be applicable, but the principles may be. And if we consider the 1969 Vienna Convention on Treaties, we see that although rules may not necessarily be transferable, the idea of customary international law, the concept of principles being able to be transferred into other contexts is a key tool we have as a legal system. So that's another point I wanted to make. And a third point I wanted to make with it in terms of accessibility is the notion of why we are here, why we are discussing this. So accessibility to the moon and outer space, of course, there have been absolutely fantastic work done by national space stations, private agents, individuals, universities, in order to be able to get us where we are now, where we were 50 years ago, where we were 60 years ago. But I think we should recognize, though, that we didn't do that. And we weren't able to get into space and develop this notion of human space exploration, from those periods of time. It was a human collective effort over millennia through cultural, temporal contributions that eventually allowed us to achieve human exploration, and which continue to be the basis for much of that exploration. And so if we consider the history which has allowed us to participate in exploration on the moon and beyond, I think then the notion of accessibility in the participation for negotiations, for dialogue, is broadened because we take account of the participants who have permitted this process to happen. And, you know, it's not just necessarily maybe a social notion or historical notion, but it's a legal notion settled in laws that I'm happy to discuss a little bit later in the panel.
Thank you, Marlene. I'm hearing, you know, sort of we look at history, embrace history. We look at the, you know, there's a lot in our history that should produce or reduce the need to think about accessibility in terms of just linearly. But I'm also hearing that we don't need to reinvent the wheel, right? You know, there are things that we can pull from. And we've talked a lot about the COPWIS, and there's nobody better to talk about the COPWIS than Peter Martinez. I'm sure while you were helping to negotiate the long-term sustainability guidelines, you felt like you were reinventing the wheel. But we're hoping that you can share with us some of your experiences working in that multilateral fora on the very unique and you know, frankly, groundbreaking sustainability guidelines you were able to achieve consensus on.
Thank you, Michelle. Well, it's a great pleasure to be participating in this panel, and I'm really excited to be part of this discussion. So thank you for the invitation. And I'm certainly happy to share some of my experiences in COPWIS and to reflect on the lessons learned from that process for the discussion that is the topic of this panel. So as we all know, space is by its very nature an international activity, right? The moment you launch something into space, you're flying over other countries and all sorts of international considerations that arise. This is why the UN has been the principal intergovernmental forum for information exchange among states about their national space activities, the forum for discussion about cooperation on exploration and the peaceful uses of outer space. It's been the forum for the progressive development and codification of international law regarding outer space activities. COPWIS was established in the very early days of the space age, December 1959, if my memory serves me correctly, with 24 member states. It currently has 95, and it's quite interesting. You can actually see images of the early composition of COPWIS where everybody in the picture more or less looked the same. And if you look at a photograph of COPWIS in session today, you will see a much greater diversity in the number of actors, which is very encouraging. So space governance, and particularly space sustainability, is not something that a single space actor, no matter how capable, or a group of like-minded actors can address on their own. It requires cooperation. And if the world didn't have a body like COPWIS, it would have had to establish one to deal with the emerging governance challenges that we are confronting today. Already in the late 2000s, the committee started to take a more holistic view of the emerging challenges of space sustainability. I remember a landmark study that was done by Carl Deutsch, a former chairman of the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee, where issues such as the proliferation of space debris, the proliferation of small satellites, the emergence of new kinds of space activities, particularly those that raise dual use concerns, the emergence of many more space actors, and also a much greater diversity of space actors, not only states, but also non-state actors. And so all of these kinds of concerns led the committee to take a more holistic approach to all of this. And in 2010, it decided to establish a working group on the long-term sustainability of outer space activities, which is quite a mouthful. So we all just refer to it as the working group on LTS. So if I say LTS, that's what I'm referring to. And the mandate of this working group was to produce a set of guidelines based on best practices. And I was selected as the chair of this process. Immediately, one of the challenges that we encountered was the need to socialize awareness that space sustainability is a common problem and everybody's concern. And there is a certain connection to this issue of the moon here as well. So one of the issues that we ran into was that many emerging space nations or other non-space nations did not view the problems of space sustainability as their own problem to deal with. They felt that the countries that made the mess should be the ones to clean it up. And so why was this a multilateral issue? And there wasn't an appreciation of how embedded space systems have become in modern society. It's really is part of the plumbing of modern life. And so others states viewed this whole issue with some suspicion as an effort by the established space actors to raise barriers to entry for emerging space nations under the pretext of environmental concerns. Remember that these discussions all started round about the time that the CubeSat revolution was taking off. You know, it was becoming much cheaper and technologically easier to access space. And then all of a sudden, these sustainability concerns were raised. So this socialization took several years, and we tried to make the process as inclusive as possible in terms of geography and the level of space capabilities. And we broke the discussion up into 4 expert groups, and quite a number of people on the call, I think, were involved in that process in one way or another. And these expert groups were deliberative fora of experts. They were not decision-making fora, but they did function under the COPUOS consensus rule, but they were not decision-making. They could recommend guidelines, which the working group would consider, and it could and did in some cases veto recommendations from the expert groups that had their own national experts in them. But the point was that because it was a bottom-up process involving experts, the first 12 guidelines adopted in 2016 were all outcomes of these expert group deliberations. And in 2018, we adopted another guidelines that had been proposed by states, and also some sort of modifications of the working group recommended guidelines. And the whole package was adopted in 2019. So throughout the whole process, a key to the success, because as I said, COPUOS takes decisions by consensus. And when I say that, I mean absolute consensus of all the member states, not just, there's no voting that happens. And so inclusivity was important, but just having diversity around the table is not enough. You need to empower all the people seated around the table to contribute in a meaningful way. And this sometimes requires raising awareness of issues. Sometimes it requires capacity building to engage in a purposeful way. And so we saw during the process of negotiating the LTS guidelines, the effect of this sort of raising awareness of capacity building, in the sense that participation in the expert group discussions went from, you know, maybe 24 experts at the beginning of the process from just a few countries, to later on in the process, 80, 90, or 100 people from a far greater number of countries. So that was, I thought, a very positive outcome of that process. As I said, COPUOS works on the consensus rule, unlike other UN bodies, so it does not vote on its resolutions. And this means that when you're dealing with very complex issues, as we were with LTS, it requires agreement on every single word in a long document, you know, typically 30 pages or more, in all 6 official UN languages. And that can be very difficult to achieve, and explains to some extent why COPUOS is so slow. It's like trying to move an iceberg. It's very difficult to move an iceberg, but once it starts moving in a particular direction, it's almost unstoppable. And although COPUOS is very small, when we achieve agreement, it is held by all the member states. Now, countries that may not have the ability to go to the moon nevertheless have an interest to somehow be part of this grand human adventure of space exploration. And fora like COPUOS create opportunities for engagement at the level of states. But we also need opportunities for engagement at the level of civil society, which is why fora such as this one are so helpful. In my view, the most significant accomplishment of the LTS process in COPUOS, quite apart from the actual guidelines themselves, is the much greater awareness that we have today among states of the issues of space sustainability. And before these guidelines were adopted, apart from the treaties, there were no internationally agreed collections of recommended practices to guide states in the responsible and sustainable conduct of space activities. We had space debris mitigation guidelines, nuclear power source guidelines, and so on, but there wasn't sort of a broader, more overarching thing, which we now have, which forms a kind of a baseline for established and emerging space actors. And I would say that the inclusion of all the COPWAS member states was what ensured the buy-in of the emerging and yet to emerge space countries. So it shows that international agreement around areas of common concern is indeed possible, and it builds a foundation for further cooperation and agreement in future. And just in closing, coming back to the moon, I think that a similar effort at inclusivity and equitable access to exploration opportunities commensurate with everyone's interests and capabilities will yield fruit and will be well worth the effort, particularly if it results in a shared vision and a cooperative governance framework for lunar activities. If you think about it, the alternative situation of a fragmented or contradictory multipolar governance regime could create conditions for mistrust, misperceptions, tensions, and possibly even conflict. So I think the inclusive approach is definitely the way to go. And with that, I'll stop and hand back to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, I mean, I think we could, I'm sure everyone on this call agrees, and I'm sure most everybody agrees in a lot of the commercial enterprises we talk to. And again, this is trying to figure out how we promote that inclusiveness. And one of the things that really struck me, what you said, and when we talk about inclusiveness, we're not just talking about nations, we're also talking about people. And it's not enough. Diversity isn't just having people at the table, it's having people at the table talking and understanding and discussing. And I think that's really important sort of at every level of society and every level of business and industry. And one thing that tests have shown over and over and over is, innovation is bred from diversity. And you need that diversity to innovate in the best way possible. And that's how humans are going to be sustainable and successful in space. We also said that you were able to show through your work at COPWAS that if you can get people to agree on areas of concern, then you can reach that consensus. And one area where people definitely agree is with respect to cultural heritage. The World Heritage Convention is successful in terms of ratifications. And so, Marlene, I wonder if you've spent a lot of time working in and through multilateral fora yourself. And I wonder if you can share some thoughts about your experience with the UNESCO system and process, and what lessons we might take from the World Heritage regime to promote accessibility in space.
Thank you for the question. I think it's a very good one because it bridges different areas, disciplinary areas, and in creating new rules or guidelines moving forward beyond Earth, it's important to consider multidimensional disciplines. And in terms of cultural heritage beyond Earth, or even accessibility in particular, I think that space law and cultural heritage law have an opportunity for some harmonization. And that harmonization is one that I think would advance the United Nations legal system, its treaty system, because both the space law treaties and the cultural heritage law treaties are part of that UN system. And we've seen this harmonization in different areas previously, for example, with the sea and the land, and in particular with the cultural conventions. So with the cultural conventions and accessibility, I think one very important lesson we can extract is that the cultural conventions are part of the UNESCO branch. So UNESCO's, the UN Charter was established in 1945. In 1945, the UNESCO Constitution was also established. And in that constitution, one of the main focuses is that it's very important to be able to collaborate between different cultures and different states, because that fosters a spirit of cooperation. It's a means for sustainability and for peace. And so when we look to space, and these are all issues that I think are becoming increasingly of concern, given some militarization and the exploitation of resources, and how that reflects on our behavior as humans on Earth and what we've done in the past in regard to those topics. So with the UNESCO treaties, there are 6 treaties, and in those treaties, there's been a progression from the 1954 Hague Convention to the 1970 UNESCO Convention that deals more with objects, of course, the monuments, underwater treaties, intangible cultural conventions, and then expression. And so what we see is that we move from objects and monuments to things that become more intangible. So we focus more on this idea, again, of culture and science and technology. And I think that's an important focus for space, because essentially that's what has taken us there. Too, within the UNESCO treaty systems, there is an emphasis on multilateralism in the negotiation process. And I think that's very important because not only does it reflect the initial UN attempts for a broad multinational negotiation, but it also allowed states that didn't necessarily have an interest in the convention that was being negotiated to negotiate and also to become part of the convention. And with time and appreciation for that particular heritage, whether it were objects that were later uncovered archaeologically or sunken vessels that were later found, or connections to that vessels that were later be able to identify. It takes time sometimes for states to really be able to take a full grasp of the opportunities and also the responsibilities connected to a convention. So being able to negotiate at that early stage, I think is definitely advantageous. And we saw that too also at the 1967 convention. And although there are opportunities for more narrow agreements, whether bilateral or just more narrow multilateral agreements, I think that we run into some risk of losing the benefits of the larger multinational negotiation benefits. But I think another lesson that we can extract from the UN cultural heritage treaties is one that came to be developed a little bit later on. And it's this idea that each culture or each state may have what is called a link, a cultural, historical, archaeological, or scientific link to the element that we're discussing. And so we saw this first in the 1982 Law of the Seas Convention, and the notion of heritage under the water arose. And so this was a new concept because in areas of jurisdictional voids, the idea that heritage existed there was one that we hadn't had. But once technology developed and we're able to identify sunken vessels, maybe sunken cities, then we were able to create this notion that there was a cultural property that may have been of importance to not just one state, but more than one state. And so it was this idea of creating legal standing for cultures or nation states with a cultural, historical, scientific, archaeological connection to the item. We create a base for more participation in a certain subject. So whether it's, an item on the moon, resources, etc., this idea of creating a link that allows for legal standing, I think is quite important. And the other thing I think we should look at, when we consider the cultural conventions, is this idea that had evolved from maybe the 1960s, in sense when we're still talking about decolonization that was being treated within the UN system, but this idea of the succession of states. So what happens to the material resources, physical, of course, but also immaterial, that passes over time, but that derive from one state, maybe that may not necessarily be there because of this legal notion of the succession of states. And so, again, a lot of consideration had been given to that because of decolonization, because of the fall of the USSR, and we're seeing it in many instances when we're finding, for example, the cargo of sunken vessels. But the succession of states, I think, is of importance. We should consider that in terms of the technologies that we've developed as we've gone forward, and any technologies that may develop, in the future. Because, at that point, then there could be more interest in states that are maybe not spacefaring at the moment, but that will become spacefaring, and that may want to have some type of legal standing to participate in any conversations at that point. So, and I think the last thing I want to mention in terms of the cultural conventions is that there's been an emphasis on capacity building. So capacity building to really share the benefits of culture and the developments of culture, not only of that one state, but of states from all over the world that have taken an obligation to share. And then in sharing that information, we have been able to create systems in which there's more identifying with what's happening. There's more need or desire to participate. And in participating, of course, there's more contribution and more capacity for growth. So these are all areas in the cultural conventions that I think we can extract, at least with regard to the principle, because the cultural conventions that exist now do not apply beyond Earth. But again, as I mentioned initially, the rules may not apply, but the extraction of principles can guide important discussions such as these.
So thank you. I think the other thing I think that I would like to point out and learning from Marlene about heritage is it's very complex. And, I hope that we're able to sort of extend into space with a little bit more simple concept of how we protect our culture and our humanity and our universality. Interesting what you said, Marlene, though, it almost feels like you're, with knowledge and with knowledge of history, with knowledge of technology comes that accessibility and that capacity building. And I think that's so important. So, but before we turn it to open questions, I just want to go back to Minoo and given what we've heard, as well as your own considerable experience, what do you perceive to be the biggest issues that threaten the concept of accessibility? And what do we need to consider in that sense to assure that space remains actually the province of all humankind?
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. I will say, listening to Marlene and Peter, I had the privilege of sitting in on the UN COPUS meetings for 3 years, really at the crux of when the discussions on LTS were happening. I can assure you there were some really interesting discussions happening there. But one of the challenges I see, and Peter alluded to this as well, he talked about how the working group was established in 2010, and it was in 2019 that the LTS guidelines were adopted by consensus. And the work that the working group did was really fantastic, but over that decade, there was rapid technological development. And I have to say, from someone who comes from a very technical background, now sitting in on the COPUS meetings, it was a completely different environment for me. So one of the challenges, I think, is that there needs to be more dialogue between the technical engineers, scientists, those people, and the lawyers, the policymakers. And I think that that conversation is happening, but it's not happening rapidly enough to account for what's happening in the space industry. So to very quickly answer your question, I think more dialogue needs to happen with different sectors of the space industry, but also we need to take into account timelines. Over that decade, there has been multiple startups that all have a business model to offers some sort of service to lunar exploration and to the moon. And as Peter mentioned, over his time, there were an increase in the number of member states, 95, I believe he mentioned. But during that time, there's also been an increase in the number of permanent observers and also an increase in the number of different actors in the space industry. So I wouldn't say it threatens accessibility, but one of the challenges is how do we ensure, again, that everybody has a seat at the table? And these conversations are encouraging participation, but also keeping up with technology.
So I just wanted to sort of say, as a new permanent observer for All Moonkind, what really struck me also about the COPOIS process is, it is very still sovereign centric, and I was really heartened by the fact that For All Moonkind was welcomed in as an NGO, and delegates would listen to us, and so there really is an option for sort of this citizen involvement in space, like I don't think you have in any other infrastructure like this. And I wanted to just ask Peter quickly, given your experience, do you believe that the existing UN infrastructure has the capacity and ability to assure accessibility?
For the question, Michelle. Well, it's interesting that you refer to the UN having the capacity and ability to ensure accessibility. I would say that this is not the primary role of the UN, as the UN cannot impose or enforce any kind of accessibility regime. This, after all, is something that the member states have to collectively decide that they want to do. And then to implement at national level. However, the UN has a key role to play in humanity developing a shared vision of space exploration. And this, of course, includes the concept of accessibility. And there, the evidence is that states believe that the UN is the appropriate forum, which is evidenced by the growing number of states that apply to join UN COPOIS. UN COPOIS is already one of the largest standing committees of the UN, which currently comprises, I think, 95 member states. And every year, more countries are applying to join it. We're also having more non-state permanent observers being admitted. And by the way, congratulations to For All Moonkind for being admitted to permanent observer status. And this shows that states see COPOIS as a forum, or the UN more broadly, as the appropriate multilateral forum to discuss questions of cooperation and the peaceful uses of outer space, of which access forms a part. So yeah, I think it's very important multilateral institution, and I think states should do everything they can to strengthen it and to make it more effective. But when it comes to enforcing accessibility, I think this is something that states have to actually implement at national level.
So sort of following up on that question, Marlene, there's, again, sort of speaking with your experience to international fora, there's sort of a two-part question in terms of if the COPOIS is not really the infrastructure to, it's the fora in which to discuss the creation of an infrastructure. Do we need a separate public infrastructure for lunar governance? And within that infrastructure, how do you empower nations to contribute meaningfully if they are not spacefaring right now?
Okay, so there are two questions, very interesting questions. With regards to lunar governance, I do think that the existing space law treaties it is correct to look at them now to see if they're offering everything that we as a community need in order to continue our space exploration, particularly given the entrance of new actors, new technologies, etc. I do think that they need to change to some degree. But I think there is a true value in the law, in the evolution of the law, rather than scrapping the law and starting over. And I think that, given the 5 separate space law treaties and the principles, there should be some study, which I know that is happening now, about how they may be revised, or there may be more treaties that could be added. And we have done that over the last, almost century, when there's need for a new treaty to develop it. But I do think that the forum within COPUOS is the appropriate forum. And I think that because of the capabilities at COPUOS to deal with spacefaring issues, understanding the climate and the context of space, it's a very specialized branch of the United Nations. Now, it's also a branch of the United Nations, or part of the United Nations, in which most states are at least comfortable with, given the history they have with the UN. Creating a new forum, I think, may complicate issues of accessibility. And branching off may also threaten established systems which maybe are not ideal, but at least important to create some kind of consistency until we are able to improve those rules and guidelines. And I think the second question, Michelle, it may have been, how do we encourage non-state,
Non-spacefaring.
Non-spacefaring to participate more in COPUOS?
In a lunar governance model.
Okay, well, I think, again, a very important factor is being able to leverage strong capacity building, because in my understanding, many states are unaware of the many wonderful things that are happening outside space. And although people in this forum and many others on Earth are very, very familiar, that others are absolutely not familiar, even at the state level. So I think that COPUOS's efforts to really, go to each region, especially virtually, this last year, to give them an overview of COPUOS, the methods they use, the objectives, I think that is very important. And more of that needs to happen. I also think that there needs to be more of an effort to educate civil society about what's happening in space. And of course, there are cultural tools like movies and songs and celebrations. Just on the 12th, there was a celebration which was established by the UN for Yuri Gagarin's first orbit around the Earth. These type of memorialization events are very important for civil society, to inform them and also to motivate them in the subject in which we're dealing. So, the UN has already taken several steps to ensure that, and not too long ago, there was a celebration also established for Galileo's use of the telescope. There was also a MOU between UNESCO and the ITU to identify different sites on Earth which have participated, which allowed the participation in the eventual evolution to human space exploration. So different observatories, whether more recent or ancient observatories and objects. And I think once people start to have more an appreciation for what is happening, and also what their cultures or other cultures around the world have done in the past to human space exploration, I think that will garner a lot of civic participation. And it could simply even be this notion of how the planets are named the way they are, and being based in Greek and Roman mythology, and that nomenclature being adopted by the ITU. So like I said, a lot of capacity building, and at COPUOS, is the Office for Outer Space Activities. They're charged with capacity building, and I know that they do quite a lot, but given the substantial increase in human space exploration, I think their capacity for space capacity building can be expanded and perhaps may be looked at?
I think it's always a question of money and funding, right? But I think it's, it's the way you talk sort of makes me feel very warm, because you're talking about all the things we've embraced as humanity, right? The nomenclature for from the Greeks and Romans and so forth. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and turn to Peter, because this question is, despite the fact that we have all of these universal understandings and common things, we seem to be in an era of increasing competition, especially re China and the Artemis signatories. How do we overcome that? What lessons can be drawn from the original negotiations behind the Outer Space Treaty and your own experiences with the LTS guidelines?
Thanks. Well, I think that we will see an element of competition, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. So the question is, where are the areas of common concern that that all countries can agree are issues that need to be jointly tackled? And I think, for example, the issues of space debris are one area of common concern. Those areas, I think, provide the basis to develop a shared understanding and common vision about our future in space as humanity, and it's kind of one step at a time. So that's the value of having discussions like this in fora like Corpus. I think there was another part of your question you were referring to, but I kind of lost the thread of that. What was
the competition, which we said is good, but what lessons can be drawn from the original negotiations behind the Outer Space Treaty? I think it's really sort of how, again, looking at how you achieve success within the COPUOS to create these kinds of instruments that seem to overcome this competitive and anti-unifying behavior.
Yeah, well, I can't remark on the negotiation of the original treaties. I certainly wasn't around at the time, and I've never done a deep study of it, of all the transcripts and so on. But what I can share from my experience of leading the COPUOS LTS discussions is that I think having an approach of genuine inclusive, making sure that that participants are drawn into the discussion, that everybody has something to contribute, that they feel that they are the process has taken their inputs into consideration. The process is as important as the outcome, and that's why I made the point earlier on that, in my mind, one of the main benefits of the LTS discussions in COPUOS is this appreciation that the space environment is a limited natural resource. It's almost paradoxical, right? Because we've traditionally thought of space as being limitless, and that you could kind of do whatever you wanted out there. And there is now a shared understanding by states that that is not the case, at least not near Earth orbit and in the radio frequency spectrum. And pretty soon that will be the case in cislunar space as well. So I think making genuine efforts to engage actors at different levels of capability with different levels of interest, and putting in the effort to empower them to engage purposefully. I think those are, it's hard work, but an approach like that does bear fruit in the long term.
Thank you, Peter. And we're coming up on our time, so I'm going to give Minoo the last words here. If you could share some thoughts maybe on what Peter has just said, or this feels like, I hope that Simonetta and Niklas's ears are ringing, because this is definitely a COPUOS and USA love fest here. So, as it should be.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. And I would say that I agree a lot with what Peter has said. You know, the first part of your question was about China versus the Artemis signatories. And really, it shouldn't be a member state versus a member state. If you look at the US, there's currently a battle of the billionaires who are taking this out on Twitter. I think that, as Peter said, competition is not necessarily a bad thing. But there is this process of negotiation, especially when we look back on the Outer Space Treaty, and that the realization that people are, sorry, not people, but companies, industry, and space actors are all on different timelines. And so having fora like Copus really bringing everybody together, we know that it's going to take time. We know that it's going to be an evolution of discussions. But, you know, as Peter rightly said, everybody's in the same room for the same reason.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry that we're not able to get to everybody's comments and questions, but I want to really profusely thank our panelists for their time and their really thoughtful and thought-provoking statements. It's always really interesting to hear from people who have been really working at it. You know, all I can say is I still think the future is really bright and accessible. Mehak, are we able to continue on, or?
Yeah, we can definitely leave this Zoom open for anybody who would like to further engage in our kind of informal after party. But we also have further programming for our Beyond the Cradle event that you can also check out and attend following this event at, yeah, it's 3:30. So that's it from our side. Otherwise, thank you again from me, from the Space Exploration Initiative, to our panelists, to Michelle for amazing moderation. Thank you so much for coming prepared and leading this wonderful discussion. I think we've learned a lot. There's really great notes that are going on in the Miro board that we will definitely compile and share in a report following this event. So thank you all to our participants, to our panelists, and we'll see you in the next one.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mehak, and thanks, Michelle. Great moderating, and enjoyed the discussion, and congratulations for this very exciting series of events that you all put on, which we follow with great interest.
Thanks so much, Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Thank you. It was nice speaking with you all.
Thank you. So I don't know if anybody wanted to make any comments in our reduced group here.
There was so much going. I was simultaneously note-taking and then captioning, and I was like consuming but it was so information dense, and I'm really excited to kind of see what kind of report we put out from this, because our goal is really to think about strategies. You know, I'm really glad that you guys all brought up this idea of civil society engaging in these kinds of fora. And, you know, as great as COPWIS is, I think one of the things we want to think about as the Moon Dialogues conveners is, how do we think about this forum as kind of complementary or, you know, engaging with those kinds of arenas? So I think, yeah, if there's any comments that anybody has, like in addition to the panelists, to our participants here, that would be really interesting to think about.
Hi, this is Jim Christofoli in Hawaii. Aloha.
Hello.
And I just wanted to mention, and I think we should have a separate session on this, but Michelle's aware of these efforts. We're working to develop a multinational coalition to help advance and diversify space innovation for all humankind. We're calling it the Global Alliance for International Collaboration in Space. And we will be working with you on COPWIS and a number of international organizations to really help advance this program. But the key areas of interests it will include developing collaboration through public-private partnerships and multinational alliances. I like to look at Gaelics as sort of a petri dish that brings together various components and and when they amalgamate, some amazing things crawl out to help advance a common vision. But we're looking at breakthroughs, initiatives in space science, applications and exploration, looking at space safety issues, including orbital space debris and space traffic management, innovations to enhance space finance, regulations, laws, and institutions, new space transportation, energy, robotics, communication systems, looking at cosmic hazards and new approaches to planetary defense, new space strategies to enable global sustainability, space education and training programs, especially related to capacity building efforts in developing countries and emerging space programs, and ultimately to help advance space exploration, space processing, key milestones to promote and enable off-world settlements. But the whole idea here is to promote public-private experiences, to move this whole process together collaboratively. So we will be approaching the United Nations. We have several scheduled scenarios coming up in terms of fora and international linkages that we're working now with the United Nations to try and move forward. So UN COPUS, I think, will be a big part of this. And I'm hoping the National Space Society can really play an instrumental role in, not being just national, but an international space society to bring together these key players. So by sharing public-private partnerships and international alliances, we can reduce the costs, enhance the benefits, and hopefully accelerate timetables for future space missions.
Definitely,
So
the Galix is definitely another sort of step in that ability to make space accessible. And yeah, we will definitely talk more offline about it. I did want to just single out one person here. I'm going to mispronounce your name, Memi, because you actually inspired a lot of the outline for this with your piece with your colleague Kwame on how can Africa get involved in space, and in the you were talking specifically about the Artemis Accords, and I was wondering what your reaction was to what you heard today regarding the infrastructures and the COPUS and the efforts that are made at the multilateral fora to bring in more nations.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for first having an opportunity for folks to kind of talk about these important issues, and then also, for reading our piece and, for seeing how that connects to a lot of this. I think it was very interesting in that I think what really made us interested in our piece was kind of looking at where we are now as almost a change in era in space, right? As the ISS goes down and China and the US and Russia put on their own international space stations, right? As we go from a world that's, governed by the UN and by, the OST to one where folks can pursue things like an Artemis Accord, which is in itself, I think, in parallel to a lot of the structures we're talking about today. But instead of being run from a centralized UN, it's being pursued by kind of a national kind of group. And it's kind of relying on bilateral agreements as opposed to multilateral agreements, and kind of how do these kind of work. And so the inspiration of our paper was not to take the typical doom and gloom of, it's privatized and it's going to be just another kind of, proliferation, and then just another kind of folks taking resources that the global South won't be able to access. I did want to look at the potential positives of it moving in a new nationalistic space, right? Because if there is a competition between great powers and accessing space, there would then be incentives for them to want to help, third world countries and other ones access that as almost part of their kind of broader humanitarian and kind of soft power approaches, as well, right? And so I think, in thinking about today's conversation, what's interesting to me is that it was very focused in kind of like a UN focused and UN kind of controlled space environment. And something that I've always thought about was, no one really thinks and talks about space law right now. I was trying to make even when I was a student at Harvard Law, we tried to make a space law journal. It wasn't that interesting, but the second people can access—
Because you can never beat the University of Mississippi Journal of Space Law.
That's fair. That's what the committee said. That's what the committee said. They said Mississippi has it covered. There's nothing we could add. So, but I do think that as space becomes more important, and really as we have more technology to access things in space, I think that we've seen how the importance of the UN can kind of drop when things actually get important to countries, and that they can just be kind of stopped by kind of any global power. And I think we could maybe brace ourselves for maybe this UN system works when there really aren't high stakes, right? But once there are bases on the moon, once there are lots of resources of countries that they're spread across an interstellar way, they're going to want more than just kind of, I mean, if you can look at how a lot of UN institutions, even like the judges, for international law, the U.S. isn't even a part of that, right? And I could see that happening to something like I think if space policy at the UN level interferes with domestic level, we'll see things like we see in the UN International Court of Human Rights, where folks will step out of that so they can pursue their national interests more effectively.
So I know that Minoo is has to leave shortly. So once again, I'm going to let you respond in the few minutes that you have left with us to his very interesting comments.
Mamie, so interesting. So I am part South African, so Africa, the continent, means so much to me. And I'm not here to defend the UN or COPUS, anything like that, but what I've seen is that I'm talking specific about Africa, for a lot of African countries, COPUS is one of the only platforms that they have to be part of this global discussion. And as Peter said, when the initial conversations of space sustainability, they thought, oh, this has nothing to do with me because, I haven't even launched a satellite as yet. How can I contribute? And it's really fascinating to see them progress through not just like learning how they can contribute, but actively contributing as well. And regarding the comment on coordination mechanisms, Africa is currently putting together the African Space Agency, which is the continental-wide agency. And I think that in itself really showcases how one continent, which is 54, 55 member states, can come together. That's half of COPUS right there, with differing agendas, different, talk about a diversity pool, including a diverse budget. I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens there. And, Africa has always been seen as, oh, we'll use Earth observation because that's what we need right now. And that's absolutely the case. But more and more you see African countries really engaging in the dialogue of space sustainability, lunar exploration, because they foresee that they need to be part of this conversation as well. But I do have to jump off. Unfortunately, this has been such an interesting conversation in total. And if anybody wants to chat further at a preferable time zone, I'm always happy to.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, well, we do have people here still sticking around. One question I'd ask for the group, anyone to weigh in, is, we do these moon dialogues. We try and do them once a month, tied to the full moon. We're, as a community that wants to have broad, wide-ranging discussions, if you have ideas for topics or speakers, we're absolutely open to hearing about that. Because, we need to hear from the folks who look at these things from as many different lenses as possible. So feel free to contact any of the conveners. Chris Johnson, Secure World Foundation, I'm one of the conveners. Michelle from For All Moonkind is a convener. MIT from Mehak from MIT, and then the folks from Open Lunar and Arizona State. We are the conveners. Feel free to contact us and say, this is the conversation that you're not having, that you should be having, both because it's necessary and because it would be, interesting to hear of those things. I mean, I'll say that one of the things that, I'm thinking about military aspects of the moon and so let's say security aspects of the moon. And I'm also thinking about some of the environmental protections and honestly, like the environmental issues of the moon in relation to commercial activities on the moon and oversight of commercial activities on the moon. But that's just, you know, what's just coming into my head, that those are conversations that we need to have. There could be other ones.
So the professional space resources class started today with the ISU. Did you guys, I don't know, I joined kind of late, so I don't know if you guys touched on that already.
Michael, could you introduce yourself? I've seen your name around, but I can't place you. Where?
Yeah, so I'm Mike from New Space NYC. I've been around for about 5 years now. It's mainly just a meetup group to kind of showcase New York. There's a lot more going on here than you would think. We have Honeybee Robotics. They touch on a lot of the NASA rovers. We have Final Frontier Design. They make spacesuits contracted with NASA. Launcher, they're a 3D printed rocket company contracted with the Air Force. They started out of the Brooklyn Navy Yard as well. And then there is a growing list of VCs, some of them specializing in space, that are here in the city as well. So it's really exciting. Yeah.
You know, when we think of space, we always think of like the East Coast and the southern states. But honestly, like, you know, Astrobotica is in Pennsylvania. There's folks in folks in like the Northeast. There's folks in Boston. There's folks in New York. We need to have like a East Coast and Midwest discussion about what all these other actors that want to do things on the moon. And then from there, who knows where we'll go? Probably, you know, people are trying to start up space companies all over the world. So yeah, good to connect. Thank you, Michael.
I think one of the really interesting things too, in terms of the accessible moon, and it's something that we're going to try and explore a little bit as we move forward, is it's one thing to think about bringing non-spacefaring nations, but it's also about bringing in underprivileged or, you know, disadvantaged areas, and how to bring them into the embrace of space as well. And that's something we're trying to do at Mississippi with our task force on the aerospace industry. Really look at, you know, and sadly, we're looking at the answer being in education at a very young age, and starting to get into, you know, the kindergarten, and there's all these studies that say, you know, if you haven't turned somebody on to space or something by 12, then that's it, you're done. Yeah, there's a lot to think about in terms of geography, diversity, you know, within a nation, outside nations, a lot of pieces to put together to make it work.
I mean, I didn't think about a career in the space field until I was older than 30. I didn't think about space law at all until I was older than 30. And if you'd had sent somebody to my high school that said, Chris, you could be a space lawyer, you should think about outer space and careers in space, I'd have been like, don't tell me what to do. Get away from me. You know, like, you can't, no, I'm not going to do that. So you can only, I mean, but I'm probably, you know, some type of strange you know, hell-bent on dissension outlier that if you tell me you should get into this, you'd enjoy it, I'd be like, you know.
I don't think it gets exposure, right? So some people just don't know that it exists.
All right. Anyway, should we wrap it up? We got other stuff to get to. Thanks everybody to.
Yep.
Thanks
everybody.
Yes.
Thank you.
And hopefully see you next
Thank
month.
you. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Michelle. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Marlene.